So welcome to the second plenary session. The title of this session is Drug Development and the Patient's Role. We'll be hearing from two speakers. The first will be Raymond Hummel, who is the Vice President and Director of Strategic Drug Development at IQVIA. He'll be talking about understanding the drug development paradigm, so it'll be a bit of an overview of how drug development is done. Following that, we'll hear from Sarah Emmons, who is the Director of Global Patient Outreach and Community Strategies at the Jane Foundation. And she will be taking you on the first step for patients within the drug development paradigm, which is the power and purpose of patient registries. So with that, I'd like to introduce Dr. Hummels.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. When I was first asked to do this by Kat and Brian and Carol from the Speak Foundation, Cure Calpain, and from the Jane Foundation, I felt it was a privilege and an honor. I've talked similar talks like this to folks with Duchenne and also at groups related to FSHD. So it's a pleasure to be here. We have to put like a disclaimer in, so that's that. But the outline for today is going to talk a little bit about living with muscular dystrophy and having a personal connection with it. I'm going to go over the classic drug development paradigm, and then I'm going to give you some differences about dealing with small patient populations that we have to think about when we're thinking about enrolling in a clinical trial. I'm going to also mention to you some of my efforts around the Muscular Dystrophy Association's Mover Hub, because my family's had an impact on that, and I think it potentially could have an impact on you. So I want you to know a little bit more about it. Then I'm going to just very briefly discuss gene therapy and impact on clinical trial designs, because other folks have given it justice for gene therapy, but I'm going to be specific more about some of the things you have to think about for clinical trial designs. I'm just going to briefly also mention on commercial implications, and then I'll leave you with some tools and some websites for you. So living with muscular dystrophy. So I actually run the Biosimilar Center of Excellence, and I also get to work in the Pediatric and Rare Disease Center of Excellence. I serve as a senior advisor to them as well as the gene therapy. And the reason that I had to get into muscular dystrophy is I have two children with muscular dystrophy. So I have a daughter who's 27 years old, and then I have a son who just turned 21. And we've written many publications together to get the word out about muscular dystrophy. We work with the MDA, and my daughter was chosen for our company, which is a Fortune 500 company, to be the speaker for Rare Disease Day. Very proud of her for that. Also wrote a book on muscular dystrophy, and when I first started writing it, the reason I did it is because my daughter said when we go to the MDA care clinics that people didn't have exactly all the information that they needed in order to move forward. And I said, well, you can go to the MDA clinic and just talk to the care person there and stuff, or just go on the web, right? And people were saying that. We were saying, no, there's a lot more information that people need to know. So the idea behind this book that my daughter and I wrote was to look at all different types of muscular dystrophy, have it available for free after you got a diagnosis, so you could look at kind of what other people are doing and what other groups are doing. And that's available. If anyone's interested in it, you can contact me, and I'll have my contact information available. I'm glad to send it to you. So let's get into the classic drug development paradigm and kind of talk a little bit before here. So what the FDA looks at, which is one of the most important things to get a drug development, is adequate and well-controlled studies. And what does that kind of mean? Well, they require a research goal or objective, right? Just kind of take us at the basics here now. They need a valid comparison with a control, some sort of control. So either a concurrent, which would be the strongest type of control, or a historical control. Or we also have to have an appropriate selection of subjects, right? So we were talking before about everyone being getting the right gene and getting the right person, the right patient at the right time. We have to, we talked before about different employment of measures to minimize bias in that, so that's where usually statistics comes in. We need well-defined and reliable methods of assessing that response, and we need an adequate analysis of the results. Again, usually comes back to statistical powering and things like that. So let's walk through some of the classic model of drug development. So you're going to hear things like phase 1 and phase 2, phase 3. You're going to talk about the approval and then the post-marketing, or generally those are referred to as phase 4 if it's required. And in all the gene therapies, it is going to be required. It's going to be very long-term monitoring. So if you get in a gene therapy trial, and if it's lucky enough that it gets approved and it's on, then there'll be you'll be monitored probably, because the FDA is going to require that to find out what goes on in a long-term setting. The preclinical phase, when you hear preclinical, what that usually refers to, so clinic is usually considered generally dealing with humans. Now, I actually have a veterinary background, so for me, preclinical might mean something different than for, say, a human physician. But in general, preclinical is that your animal studies. So that's going to be your animal studies, the toxicology studies, usually some of that bench chemistry synthesis, and the formulation work. And that might not be so for a formulation of a product, it might not be the product that's the commercial grade or the one that gets out. It's the one they're starting with. So this is preclinical, and this is prior to the investigational new drug application, or when it actually goes to phase 1, when you can put in there. So what would be an average size of maybe phase 1? So that's the first time it's in human. So first in human, you'll hear that term too. So that typically, and this isn't in rare disease, but in the classic model of drug development, that's typically, say, 50 to 100 patients, so a small number of patients. And that occurs after that investigational new drug application submitted. It's also called the first in man, like I said. And you'll hear things like SAD and MAD, so single ascending dose or multiple ascending dose studies to get an idea of what the drug does to the body. That's pharmacokinetics, or what the body does to the drug, more like pharmacodynamics. And then the next phase you'll move to would be like to phase 2, where it's tested in larger number of patients. And now you go out of sometimes from the healthy volunteers just to see what it does in the body. Now you're talking with patients, so that'd be like more classical, considered a phase 2. And that's tested in the patient population of interest, trying to make sure that those doses selected are optimized, right? Because if you go too low, then the drug may not work, and if you go too high, it may cause some toxicity, right? So you want to get it right. And then the phase 3 is the confirmatory trial. That's the one where now you kind of know you got your dose from phase 2, now we're going to put it in phase 3, and that's going to be the one that's going to be a confirmatory study to get it approved. And typically 2 confirmatory studies are generally required in the US for registration. And the desire generally is to be placebo. And there's some issues we're going to talk about that, because certainly for patients with rare diseases like limb-girdle, they're going to be less likely to want to go into a placebo-controlled trial than if you could get the product. And then the primary endpoint is generally based on statistical inferences related to clinical relevance, right? So we talked about before, the other speakers talked about biomarkers before. So like maybe measure the amount of dysferlin. If you don't have dysferlin or you don't have sarcoglycan, you measure that. And that's an indirect marker, so it's a biomarker, right? It's taken from the body. And you want to correlate that with a clinical benefit, maybe something like you can live something longer, you can do something longer. And then the phase 4 refers to any clinical trial work that's done out of there. So let's kind of put these into some perspectives and see where we're at. So here's a diagram that was taken off the FDA website. And on the left-hand side is kind of that preclinical research. So that's the synthesis and purification, animal testing we talked about. Then it moves along in that phase 1, 2, 3, kind of a nice steady way. And then for things like if you get something maybe special like accelerated drug development review, which is used in cancer and also in the muscular dystrophies, you can do that. And then it has the different timelines and stuff like that to go through there. That's the classic one. But with small patient populations like limb-girdle muscular dystrophy, you're going to see some differences in that. So that's the kind of the classic development. But you're going to have some things like that I think are applicable today, and you'll be hearing from other speakers who've done this, is that we need to look to surrogates to see how we can move things forward, and how the patient voice is actually extremely important within the drug development process and not always fully used. So one of the things I wanted to alert you guys about was, because this is different for limb-girdle and for others, is that the patient advocates submitted the first FDA guidance ever. So patient advocates have never submitted FDA guidance. That hasn't been done until 2014, and that was through Parent Project Muscular Dystrophy. And luckily, Pat's going to be here later tonight to be able to talk to you about that. But this is huge because this is a model for other rare disease groups, especially limb-girdle muscular dystrophy, and it reflects a growing need for clarity in this space. It also reflects, I think, a growing capital that's being invested into new treatments. And that's why we're all here today, because there's more capital being raised, and we're moving into an area, I think it was Dr. Johnson said earlier, that we can't quite keep up with it. So it's kind of early days on one hand, but yet things are going very, very rapidly. So it behooves us to educate ourselves to make sure that we know about the trials and what some of the risk benefits are, so we decide about going into a trial. Now, there is no regulatory guidance yet exists for the study of limb-girdle muscular dystrophy in patients. Another couple of points I want to make is that regulatory agencies are increasingly amenable to novel approaches. So you've got kind of the classic drug development time. Now let's talk about a few things that might be different from what I just told you. So muscular disease history is tied with oncology, history of oncology cancer development. I've actually talked with Janet Woodcock earlier at the MDA conference about this, and basically it's because of the life-threatening nature of the diseases and the high unmet medical need. So But these trials are smaller. Exondys 51, for example, for Duchenne approval was based partly on one pivotal study in 12 Duchenne muscular dystrophy patients. So remember I was telling you before, 50 to 100, maybe 200. So now we're talking smaller numbers, so that doesn't quite fit. So some of the statistic things that I was telling you about making a primary endpoint that would be statistically, well, now we're saying we need like clinical benefits. We need to be able to demonstrate clinical benefits and things like that. Study endpoints are different too when you're talking about some of the rare disease for ambulatory versus non-ambulatory. So, you know, for ambulatory, someone had mentioned earlier, one of the speakers had mentioned a North Star ambulatory assessment or make a walking measure. You guys have seen that, you know, like a 6 or 10 minute walk test or something. And then for the non-ambulatory, it's more like something like upper limb strength or things like that. Now, some of the best endpoints, from my opinion, are correlated with natural history study information, but sometimes the information is not known. And that's why, like I said, we're early days, but we're trying to get this information. And sometimes also, because this is such an important set of diseases, you may actually combine the phase 1 and 2 together to test a couple of doses and directly in patients. So kind of skip going through that all healthy volunteers, but actually just go into patients with that. And given the intense unmet medical need, regulators may allow for accelerated approvals, so things make them go faster than they normally would, maybe just on a phase 1 or 2 study. So you could actually get it approved on just early clinical data, not doing those phase 3 studies that we just talked about that are typically required. If there is efficacy seen, but then you may be asked to do, say, a post-approval commitment, like that phase 3 study, but do that after it's approved. So you have to kind of prove that actually, okay, it looks like it works in a small number of patients. We will give you, say, a tentative approval. This is the FDA saying that, but we will want you to demonstrate further safety and efficacy down the line, just to kind of make sure that everything we're saying and everything we're thinking about it today is confirmed later in the future. And then gene therapies considerations I think are unique, so I'm going to talk about those in a different section. So let's talk about kind of how we can get a handle on all these classical problems and how we can kind of move things together. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of my interactions with the MDA, because all of us have had interactions with the MDA probably at an MDA care clinic. So from like 2013 to 2017, I worked with the MDA because they had selected our company, which was then called Quintile. So I worked for a company called IQVIA. That's a merger between IMS and Quintile. So two different companies come together. It's called IQVIA now. But the old company I worked for, so Quintile's legacy, so that's where that name comes from. And they were going to use the registry to study the natural history of muscular dystrophy and related diseases. You know, they have 43 different diseases under their umbrella. Limb-girdle was prioritized to one of the top ones. And their goal is to create a research and collaboration platform, just like we talked about earlier today with some other things. And then later, my daughter and I published a paper called The Growing Case for the Rapid Identification of Patients with Muscular Dystrophy for Clinical Trials, and we sent it to all the 30 MDA board members. I've talked to the former CEO, and I invited them to come to our company to host their MDA board meeting. And we had a neurologist and several other folks to talk about some of the platform technology for how this might work. And the board agreed that a revamped natural registry was needed. So as many of you know, they have a new CEO now at the MDA, and our company has the privilege now of being able to build out their neuromuscular observation mover data hub. And we published several articles on that. If anyone's interested to learn more about it, I'm glad to send you those. That's public information. That's the one paper on the right that we wrote. So the press release was done last year, and basically how it works, just so you have some idea what it is there's about 150 MDA care centers all across the United States. And we're building it out at a rate of 25 new care centers a year. So basically what we're trying to do is get the access to the electronic health records, medical claims information, prescription data, all that, and put it in a HIPAA type of environment so that it's protected and follows all the rules. But thinking is, if we can look at little tiny pieces of information over a long period of time, we'll have a lot of information. And could we possibly learn about limb-girdle from Duchenne? My answer is absolutely you can. Can you learn about FSH from limb-girdle? Absolutely. And can it go back ways? Absolutely. So the way I was kind of looking at it, which was very different than a lot of folks, is that the classic paradigm is everybody does their own little thing, and all the patient advocacy groups work all apart, and then they're all kind of working what they can to try to help their patients. But I was trying to think of it, how can we turn it upside down and look at what's in common with everything rather than what's different? And that's part of what's behind this Mover Data Hub. So it's too much to go into for this, but I think it's interesting because it can be utilized for other rare diseases. So not just limb-girdle, not just Duchenne, which are were prioritized by the MDA to be some of the highest ones in that. Everybody knows that there's a growing pipeline of opportunities. We are gifted to have a lot of these folks here today. In fact, I've met many of them that are listed on this slide. Thank goodness for folks to get us lunch and to help us here to be able to have this nice venue that's here. And even some things about mover, you know, we talked to Leanna Orlando from the MDA. This was published last fall. The limb-girdle muscular dystrophy, from kind of being lower prioritized, is now one of the top prioritized. First new diseases will be added in 2019, so this year that's being added there. And again, it's early days, but it's being grown, so we're getting more and more information. There's few natural history studies. That data can help with that. It'll represent the first central repository for clinician entered data across all the different subtypes. So I think this is another tool in our armamentarium, as you guys know, and it's growing. I just want to touch on gene therapy here because there is some impact on clinical trial designs that I think is going to be important, and I want to note. So, not me, but the U.S. National Library of Medicine says that gene therapy is an experimental technique that uses genes to treat or prevent disease, and this is directly taken off their website. So there's different ways to do it, right? And there's folks here that are a lot smarter than me about gene therapy that I've already learned some things this morning that have been great. But you can replace those mutated genes. We know about that. We know we can inactivate or knock out certain genes. We can do that. We can introduce new genes to the body to fight them. So those are all different terms. And you know, I'm not the expert to talk about those, but I just wanted to mention those. And although gene therapy is a promising treatment option for a number of diseases, including inherited disorders, like some types of cancers and limb-girdle muscular dystrophy, and I added that in, the technique remains risky and still under study to make sure that it will be safe and effective. So as such, gene therapy is currently being tested only for diseases that have no other cures. I think that's important to keep in mind as we consider the risk-benefit as we go forward to determine whether we're going to go into clinical trial or not. So let's give some kind of gene therapy backgrounder that's important for trial designs. And let's go to NORD, so the National Organization of Rare Diseases. You guys are probably all familiar with that or have heard about it. So what have they said? Well, they said gene therapy has been around for about 20 years. In my career at IQVIA, I've been there since 1993, so over a period of 26 years at the company. And for about 13 years, I worked in due diligence, evaluating products. And if I was asked to say, if you could describe gene therapy in one word based on most of your investment life while you were there, and that was over 7-8 years ago, I would say graveyard, because most of them didn't work. But there's been some tremendous progress that's been made in the last couple of years, and that's why I think it's important for us to understand it and to understand what it is there. So the goal of gene therapy is a cure, but it's unknown if the gene therapy will result in a cure. So it could just result in disease modifying right now. That's potential. Some types of cells are amenable to gene therapy, we know at present, and some are not. We know that the FDA needs to approve all products to ensure that they're safe. That's just part of their mandate. We know that side effects are affected with these types, like possibility of immune reactions, and it's unknown if the gene therapy will be covered by insurance at this time, and this is from their website. And then it's interesting too, here's just a quote that was taken by a patient advocacy group. As the world looks to gene therapy as a cure for genetic diseases, this is at the bottom of the slide. It says, like Duchenne, but I think it's the same for limb-girdle. Developing a therapy that works on a large scale is complicated. And we were talking about the adeno-associated virus as a significant obstacle because you have to make a lot for it. They actually went ahead and invested in a company just because they said having access to the pre-existing antibodies and the option to redose, meaning right now you can only be treated one time with a gene therapy, those are considerations that you need to consider and she thinks should occur. So let's talk about some of the commercial implications. So I think the two that seem to get a lot of news press these days, and up until about 8 months ago, it was Luxturna mainly. So that was interesting because that's the first gene therapy for an inherited disease, and it got approved. So, you know, from those days when I used to look at the due diligence, I would look at monkey studies that were 10 or 15-year monkey studies. Now, I don't know about you guys, but to look at a horizon for 10 or 15 years, be working on primate studies or something like that, knowing you don't even know what the political climate's going to be, how your family's going to look in 10 years and what things are going to do, that's a long time, right? But the FDA needed those kind of things because they wanted to make sure that it was safe. But the first gene therapy was approved for that in December 2017, so things are starting to move along here. And that worked by carrying a gene into the eyes of patients born with retinal dystrophy. And they, one of the things that they used was by having patients go through a maze. And people that couldn't see before could now see. So to me, that's like a borderline miracle. So that's pretty dramatic results. But there was a cost associated with it, and it was around $500,000. And then more recently, what many people are interested or have seen maybe through their web updates is that just recently, so just May 2019 for infants with spinal muscular atrophy, which now we're getting a little closer into the neuromuscular disease area here. These were called floppy babies, and they had a low life expectancy. And now I saw pictures of them, videos of people that are walking, children that are walking that are 3 and 4 years old. In my opinion, again, that's like almost nothing short of a miracle. So I think there's a lot of hope with gene therapy, and I think that that is an amazing thing. When I talked to, or was reading this one article, the Food and Drug said that they foresee approving 10 to 20 cell and gene therapy products each year by 2025. And then Janet Woodcock, when I talked to her at the MDA, she confirmed that. So you guys are going to be seeing more and more news out there. There's going to be a few missteps because these things are complicated and they're difficult. It's going to take a village to find a cure, and you're going to see some missteps. But I'm telling you, I'm really hopeful that I think there's a lot of really good things going on here. So that's kind of what I wanted to touch for that. So, kind of for a summary, I guess right now there really is no cures for the muscular dystrophies. As such, there's a huge unmet medical need. I think that drives each one of us to try to think about and pray about what we could do next to try to help to move these things forward. I think they're genetically and phenotypically diverse. I mean, the speakers this morning talked about some of the challenges we have with all these different subtypes, whether it's 36 and whether there's an R or a D by it or a letter. There's a lot of different genetic and phenotypically diverse universe out there of limb-girdle muscular dystrophy, and they represent a formidable challenge. I think that the better genetic testing, which I was really encouraged by the speakers earlier this morning about that, means a faster diagnosis. And as we can get folks more quickly to clinical trial readiness, which is, I think, the goal of every person in this room. I think the number of products in the limb-girdle muscular dystrophy space is encouraging because it's continuing to rise. I mean, even 5 years ago, it was little to hear about that. And I read things like business analyst reports that come out of New York by very smart people. And they said, on the horizon, limb-girdle was not really on the horizon. It was more around the Duchenne. And now with some of the bigger companies acquiring assets and getting these things and putting capital behind them, we are really at a great trajectory now, I think, for change. And I think we're going to see a lot of change in the next couple of years. So it's fantastic to see that. I think the cell and gene therapy represents the potential for a cure. And that, I think, is, again, what we're all here for. Interesting that we're building this. Thank you. Our company's helped building out this MDA Mover Data Hub. It's got a lot of parts, I can tell you, my friends, but I think that it's a very interesting concept, and I am still behind it. There's a lot of work to be done. We learned about different ways and different approaches. One of the things with the Data Hub that I think in the perfect world, not the world we work in, but in the perfect world, we would have everyone collaborating, working together to try to make limb-girdle muscular dystrophy and these other muscular dystrophies a top priority, not only for our legislators and, and our scientists and our academics, but also industry, and kind of all working together. And that's one in a large armamentarium of a lot of people trying to do that. I think we can help match eventually with the limb-girdle patients with clinical trials, so I'll have more and more options. Right now, limb-girdle patients can only enroll in one gene therapy trial at present, so the presence of neutralizing antibodies to some of these viruses is a real concern. It needs to be explored. The area, I think, is rapidly expanding, though, and with the lure of large market potential. The one thing I look at the price tags is certainly it's not something that has been fully understood, nor is it something that I fully understand as either a payer or from the payer perspective or from an industry perspective. But I look at it as a parent of 2 kids with muscular dystrophy that $2.1 million doesn't look real big if you have to put it in the broader context. And let me give you a broader context. Our company published a report last year that's publicly available. Anyone can read it if you want to read it in its totality. It's called the Neuromuscular Report, and it's from IQVIA Institute. And they're trying to get a handle on what the costs are of neuromuscular diseases in the United States. And they said about 250,000 people in the United States have a neuromuscular disease. And that represents 46 billion with a B cost to the United States a year. If that's not a time for change, then I don't know what is. And even though I think there are some failures, like I mentioned before, are inevitable as we get through all this, I think they provide learnings for future clinical trials. So thank you very much.
Sorry, I'm just going to advance here.
Sorry about that.
That's okay. There we go. Thank you, Ray. I'm Sarah Emmons, and for the past 8 years, I've been focused on subtype 2B, or dysferlinopathy, at the Jane Foundation, where I've had the privilege of speaking, connecting directly with clinicians and patients from around the world. And one of the fundamental needs in common that people from across all borders and phases of progression and economical backgrounds are the needs to connect, to be connected, to understand how to best care for themselves and prepare for the progression, understand what's going on with their muscles and their bodies and prepare their families, to be accounted for clinical trial recruitment, and to know what's happening on their disease-specific research. And so that's where I'm excited to share about the power and purpose of patient registries with you, because that is one way right now that our communities can fill some of those needs. So overview of today will be, what are patient registries? There are many different types of registries, and we'll probably be seeing more types in the future as clinical trial recruitment happens. Why are they so critical, especially to the LGMD communities? What purposes do they serve, or can they serve, or can we create for them to serve? The power of your participation. I know that sometimes listening to speeches and presentations about what's happening, especially with science, can be very exciting, but also overwhelming, because you may turn away from that presentation and wonder, okay, but how does this impact me today? What can I do today? And that's why I'm really excited to be able to share information about registries, because that is one way, no matter where you are, if you're able to come in person or not, you can contribute to progress through participating in registries. And I want to also introduce in this talk the different registry types that are available now and what we predict will be coming soon. What is a patient registry? In general, it's a collection of data on a specific group of people. There are many different types, though, so you'll hear the word used, but it may not be used in the same way depending on the person who's talking to you. A mover data hub is one particular type I'll touch on today. That's a clinical entered data, but there are contact registries and different types we'll go through over this talk. But in general, I think one of the quotes I read of Pat Furlong's that was simple and really took it home is, in terms of PPMD's history and their patient registry work, is the patients didn't want to wait for someone to come and bring progress to them, so they started it themselves through their own data collection in their registry. So the different types of registries, there are many. I'll just go over a few on a broad scale. Traditional patient registries that are research-led, gathering data to answer a question researchers have or to inform research. That's very different from patient-powered registries, which can cover, having a place to recruit for future clinical trials, being on the map for recruitment, mobilizing and preparing, gathering data to educate, advocating for each other and with each other. Then clinical trial registries are what we anticipate seeing in the future for the LGMDs, where your participation and progress is being tracked for the use in a clinical trial data collection. Could be short-term or could be long-term. And then there's hybrid customized registries like what the Jane Foundation has been developing over the years that kind of touches on a bunch of different qualities that you'll see above, but also incorporates direct connections. And we found that having a place for patients who are genetically confirmed to be able to reach out to the researchers working on their disease directly, or to advocacy organization members directly, or to other patients directly, having that place is really valuable. You'll see with registries that you have many different opportunities. Obviously, gathering as a disease-specific group of individuals, but one thing that's really been powerful to observe for me, that's really fed into my passion for the work, is to see how people's lives are transformed just by connecting with each other, because nobody understands you like other patients. It's been really beautiful to watch and powerful to see how people expand from just connecting as a group in a specific subtype of limb-girdle muscular dystrophy. Collecting detailed patient experiences that no one knows to ask about. This one really rings home in that it's frustrating to go to a clinic or to go for an assessment and be given kind of a generalized type of test or survey that doesn't necessarily touch on what's affecting you personally on a day-to-day basis and your progression. And so but people don't know what to ask you if they aren't kind of informed from the beginning. So a patient registry can be a place where that information can be collected and the patients can share what's happening with each other and also get it documented so that we can build out better ways to assess the LGMDs. You can directly contribute to progress, so I think that there are times where it can be overwhelming or isolating going through your day-to-day, but knowing that you are directly connecting and contributing to progress through participation in a registry, I can't underscore how important that is enough, because I think sometimes patients don't get the feedback, you don't have the visibility that industry or patient advocacy leaders have when they talk to one another, but I can assure you that what you contribute into a registry or in your community makes a huge difference given the low prevalence of each of the subtypes. So it's a direct way to contribute. Empowering yourself, but also empowering the community as a whole. And that's one thing about this conference I'm so excited about, is that we do have to focus on our subtypes in terms of our discovery scientifically and in mobilizing our communities. But together as a whole, we are empowered and stronger and larger. We have a bigger voice. And so I think that the registries coming together is very powerful. We can expedite progress. We don't have to wait for progress to come to us. The patients can expedite that through participation. Registries are really critical for the limb-girdle muscular dystrophy patients in that they can supplement areas that clinics aren't necessarily set up to handle. We've experienced this at the Jane Foundation, where we may want to help recruit for a study, and there we may know of clinicians like clinicians you've met here at the meeting who are already really specialized in limb-girdle, but not all are. And so we, as a registry, we can help recruit, get the word out, spread awareness about different opportunities for involvement that a clinic can't do by themselves very effectively, and so that's one way registries can supplement. We can mobilize our community much quicker, having a registry ready to go, expose issues specific to the subtype. So without having a registry that's documenting what's happening with your specific subtype of LGMD, it's hard to expose what those specific issues are that you need more support with, or to inform clinical care management. You can also document what's important to you. And so it may feel really casual if you're making a comment in a registry or you're sending information to a registry curator. It may feel kind of casual, like, yeah, I'm just telling them that I'm having a hard time doing X, Y, or Z. But that can then turn into that person informing a researcher in a conversation that it was mentioned, that can get them thinking about why that may be happening or the mechanism behind it, which can then completely expedite the understanding of what's happening or even instigate a research study. So you may not be seeing how your comments are impacting the community, but I just want to bring awareness to the fact that they are, and to continue on, if not ramp up, how you share it, even if it feels like it's just a comment you're making that's casual in a registry. If the registry is curated in such a way that it's gathering that data and sharing it, then you can know that that could make a really big difference. Providing insight on diagnostic pathways, misdiagnosis, and genetic variations has been a huge theme in my work in terms of patient identification. And so patients sometimes feel alone in the fact that they've been given this genetic report and that it may have unclear results and they're not sure what to do with it. This is a huge issue. It's not just one subtype, it's an issue in general. And I think that there are different ways to go about approaching that issue, but just having it documented in a registry that's collecting information about your diagnosis is the beginning. So one of the things that we're doing is to try to get to the bottom of unclear variants in the gene that we're studying, which is dysferlin, but this can be done. There's an interest in this, and so even if you have unclear results, communicating that with the registry curators, I think, is really critical. And also, the registry is a huge, sometimes the very first thing that our organization gets asked by potential interest for developing drugs for our subtype, which is 2B, is, do you have a registry? How many people are there? Where are they? So with such tiny populations scattered across the globe, it's really important to have a centralized hub. And eventually, if there are multiple registries for the different subtypes, it'll be really important to mobilize them, which I'll talk about a little bit later. So the purposes that they can serve, collecting natural history data, I put that in quotes because I find that a lot of times patients are they're not used to the jargon of what is natural history. I remember when we were having some conversations about this at the Jane Foundation in the beginning of our clinical outcome study, which is a natural history. It came up, do patients know what natural history is? What is that? And it's like, what is that? Going to the dinosaur museum? What are we talking about? And so the scientists go, oh, okay, let's think of another way to talk about this. So this is when you have a rare disease that has never been studied or officially documented, and you go to a clinic, they have nothing to work off of. They don't have any natural history. So it's following the natural progression of that disease in a way that can be documented, and that information is accepted by the medical community. So it's very specific, and it has to be done in a certain way. It can't be just a patient sending their information to an organization saying, here's what's happening to me. It has to be done on a larger scale officially. So the natural history data collection, a lot of what registries that you'll hear about are trying to accomplish, especially for these rare diseases that don't have longitudinal progression data, is to serve this purpose of collecting natural history data, which Meredith will talk about in detail. I really highly encourage you to get familiar with the importance of that for our communities, since we don't have natural history data. A lot of us don't. Analyzing patient-reported outcomes, with you talking about outcomes and how your life is affected by the disease, or quality of life, which I have down below, QOL. Your quality of life, documenting how that is impacted by the disease, seems like it would be obvious, but I think that we have to step back and be generous in sharing, because it isn't always obvious, or it isn't always well documented how your life is impacted, but that is a huge tool. That's where some of this power in the registry is documenting how your life is impacted, and then getting that officially on the map through that registry so that then change can happen. And then patient-family networking. This is where I get really excited about the use of registries, because this is where, instead of just preparing for the future, your life can be impacted today through networking with other patients. You're having a hard time about something really small. I notice in our registry, someone will mention something small that they're struggling with that day, small meaning a task. And they're just like, well, how do other people handle this? And when you have people from around the world with your same genetic disease chiming in, it's incredible. And I really love watching that, because then I know that in real time that person was helped instead of having to wait for later. And so that's where a hybrid registry, or a registry that also incorporates some kind of way that patients can communicate with each other, can be incredibly empowering. And it can also fuel you to continue to participate, so that you feel like you have a network of people who can be there for you as well. You don't have to travel every time to be there for one another. Identifying clinical care needs is a huge part. With our registry intake process, one of the advantages of having a small community, a small population of people, is that we can have one-on-one conversations, and we can listen to people individually. So we get to hear about what's happening with diagnosis, or what's not happening, or what isn't happening at clinic, or you may not be going to a doctor who's really well versed with the limb-girdle muscular dystrophies. And so when we hear about that, one way that the organization who's curating a registry can come in and supplement and try to make change happen in real time is we can reach right out to that doctor, and we can provide them with some publications on your subtype. So that's one of the ways that a registry can help you in real time while we gather data for future progress. I wanted to put this in here just to put the idea out there with you. I think as non-scientists, a lot of times we don't really think about how data is collected and why that matters. But one of the frustrations that I know the leadership of our organization confronts sometimes is that someone may have data and they're not allowed to share it, or there are regulations that ban them from being able to share it openly and freely for different reasons. So I wanted to put this out there and just bring awareness to the fact that different registries serve different purposes, and with tiny populations of patients, it is probably going to be pretty critical to participate in multiple registries, because if you're participating in a clinical registry like Mover, and if there's any kind of limit on how that information can be shared because it's clinical and there's just regulatory that are going to be around that, then participating in another registry at the same time could help the data get shared in different ways much faster than if we had to wait. And so I just want to encourage people to consider the fact that participating on multiple levels could be really a good way to make a difference with progress and expediting it with rare diseases. There's clinician-entered data, which is a must for different regulatory. So you may have shared a bunch of information in the patient contact registry, but that may not be accepted for approval and use in other studies. So that's why it might be really important to also participate in a clinical registry, because that chances are the way that those are designed, that data is going to be able to inform for approvals or approval requests versus the patient registry, which may be more on the discovery level of things, where we're trying to think of new questions to ask to inform the clinical registry, or there may be a combination. Your participation is very powerful, and I just want to really, I know that sounds really simple, but I think that those of us working in the field every day, we see it, but I feel like it's not always exposed to you, and your participation is huge. It makes a very big difference, and it creates the momentum that you're feeling here today. It's why people are here to talk with you, is because it came from patients, and it's your participation that starts to generate this power. So building robust registries, even registries that start out just as a small patient organization Excel spreadsheet, is a beginning. And I think that building them and continuing to develop them are going to build a case to drug developers that your subtype is one to pick up and put in the pipeline. That's a big one that we've utilized with our registry, is what can we do in our registry to prepare to hand it off to make the drug development process more streamlined or to expedite it for them. You have a limitless ability to participate. You don't have to be traveling for it. You can do it remotely. And so I also want to just put this out there that it's a real positive here for people who are in really tough situations to know that you do have power here by participating. Some examples: the limb-girdle subtype specific organization registries or contact registries. I'll go through a quick list of those that are represented that we know about. Clinical Registry Mover, very excited to hear about this and to know it's happening. Ray had talked about it, and Liana's going to give a talk about it too in a breakout session. Encourage you to get familiar with it. Really happy that you're learning about it and that it's happening in clinic. Like I said, the way that data is collected is really important for our future. Then I also wanted to talk about registries that are curated in a network. And one of the wonderful things our colleagues in Europe have been working very diligently on, very professionally over the years, is networks. That's one thing in the United States that we're really lacking. And so I want to bring this up. The TG-DOC is the Global Data Oversight Committee, the Treat NMD Global Data Oversight Committee, and they have been doing this with DMD and SMA, and I want to show you what's been happening at the end of this presentation to give you a sense of how registry networks, how powerful those can be. I also want to just plant the seed that there will probably be new registries coming in on the horizon, and to give you guys that information ahead of time, especially as we approach clinical trials with gene therapy, is that to be aware that there may be a need, a very important role that you could play in participating in those registries as soon as possible could be coming up. So some of the subtype registries, you may know of them, but just to make sure that everybody's aware, Type 2A has a global patient registry, and you can register online. It's self-registered type of registry and managed directly by that Coalition to Cure Calpain 3. Oops. Let's see if I can, there we go. The Dysferlin Registry that we've been curating at the Jane Foundation, it is our agency registers patients, so if patients want placement in that registry, they inquire with us because it's a genetically confirmed diagnosis registry. So we're really trying to prepare for clinical trial recruitment, zero downtime. So having patients who are genetically confirmed in that registry is important, which is why it's agency entered. But we also help people who have unclear diagnosis. And then the global FKRP registry for LGMD2I. Patients can, this is really unique in that patients can nominate a doctor to enter their clinical details into this registry. The Kurt and Peter Foundation, LGMD2C, the Fruings are here at the meeting, and I think it's really wonderful to have representation. LGMDs are not just adult onset, they're pediatric forms as well, as you all know, and so having representation of both. This is the first time we're all getting together, both adult onset and pediatric onset. LGMD2D Foundation is self-registered, and those sites, the 2C site and the 2D site, include resources and updates for community there. And then pretty new is the LGMD2L Foundation. We're really happy to see that come to fruition, self-registered online. And it's very exciting to see these things starting. I would just encourage you to seek out, if there isn't a registry for your subtype, the Jane Foundation would be happy to help you. We would share some of our contacts and help you get started with that. CMDIR covers a huge umbrella of congenital muscular dystrophies. This is an incredible registry. They have a ton of resources, support groups, links, and it's a very active, amazing registry. If you have any type of congenital muscular dystrophy listed here, I would encourage you to take a look at that website. And then TreatNMD is incredible network, and so they are doing amazing things both in research and for patients. And Helen Walker coordinates their registries, and she is someone you can contact if you want to get in touch about registries in this network. And then the MDA Mover Hub that you've been hearing about that's happening has recently, I don't know how recently, but fairly recently added LGMDs into this hub, which is very exciting. If we envision what's coming, which I think we all want to be coming very soon, and I think, you know, from everything that's happening, everybody's working really hard on having that happen. Establishing common core data sets is going to be something that's really critical. And normally you think this is something the clinicians are going to be talking about. Leave it up to the clinicians, you know, they can figure this out. But actually I think it's really empowering for patients to understand this, because if you understand it, you realize what role you play in seeing this progress happen faster. So I'm going to give you some examples of this through the TreatNMD TG Doc network and show you with a couple slides how this has an impact on sharing data for very small populations like the limb-girdle subtypes. So we're managing the inquiry of flow from drug developers is something that a network that's curated can do, like the TG Doc is doing, and curating the intake process professionally. So a lot of times with the patient contact registries, you may have a patient who has taken it upon themselves to start a 501c3 and to start a registry. And that's one type of patient contact registry. You may have a whole organization like C3 for 2A, or the Jane Foundation for 2B, or the 2I Research Fund. So there's a ton of variety when it comes to the patient contact registries, but what we don't have a whole lot of is these networks like the TreatNMD TG Doc is doing. So common core data sets, I just want to show you a quick slide that was shared by Craig Campbell of the TG Doc TreatNMD network. And this is really exciting information from the DMD and SMA community. So they curate this network of global registries for DMD and SMA. So they have what they've established as mandatory data sets to collect. And the reason is that as the DMD community branched off, and there were lots and lots and lots of different organizations that were handling patients and registries and different things, is how do we pool our information so that it can be utilized and not wasted? So having a common core data set so that information can be pooled and used as a whole is a big concept we need to constantly think about. Same thing with SMA. They had their common core data sets that were mandatory. Then they had additional information that was being collected for these registries, and then they have their highly encouraged items for these registries. So what they're trying to do is create something that all the registries have in common. Even if they're done differently, at least they have this in common so that together they can have a much larger data set. And what I want to finish with today is to show you an example from the TreatNMD Global Registry Network of the inquiries. And this is really exciting because this was for SMA and DMD. They shared this information on a timeline of the inquiries they got from drug developers for information from their registries. So if you were at all wondering how powerful the registries are, I just want to show you that the registry network, this example here from DMD and SMA, that this is one of, there were more, but this is one example of the inquiries over the years from drug developers that came in. We're going all the way up to 2018 here for information from those registries. Inquiries saying, can we please have information on your populations? And so the registries are incredibly powerful and one of the first places that developers are going to go to get a sense of the climate and what's happening and where it's happening and what else can be done. So this is one way I think you can be incredibly empowered by participating in patient registries. I just want to thank Catherine, Brad, and Carol for bringing us all here and for putting this on. I want to give a huge thank you to every person participating in a registry or curating a registry or inquiring with a registry, and the development of therapies would not be possible without you. I want to thank all the organizers and obviously the Jane Foundation for their passion behind the work that we do with our registry. If you need any information on getting a registry started, or you want more feedback on registries, or you just want connections, we'd be happy to connect you. You can send an email to patients@jane-foundation.org or find me or Lori or anyone from the Jane Foundation here. Thank you so much.